They say the road to hell is paved with good intentions. Mine wasn't. Mine was paved with a single, desperate lie that spiraled into a 3-year masterpiece of deception. My name is Claire. To my husband, David, I was a warrior, a fragile soul fighting a battle for her very life. To my lover, Julian, I was a wealthy, high-powered executive with a high-stress job that required constant travel and absolute discretion. Neither of them knew the other existed. And for 3 years, I lived in the suffocating space between those two lives, fueled by the blood, sweat, and tears of a man who was literally working himself into an early grave for a ghost. It started during a summer when David and I were drifting. He was a high school history teacher. Steady, kind, and predictable. But predictability can feel like a slow death when you're hungry for fire. I met Julian at a rooftop bar in the city, 40 miles and a lifetime away from our quiet suburb. Julian was everything David wasn't. Impulsive, expensive, and entirely uninterested in the mundane details of a woman's real life. He saw the designer handbag I'd saved 6 months for and assumed I was a corporate shark. I didn't correct him. In fact, I leaned into it. The thrill of being someone else, someone powerful and unburdened, was a drug more potent than anything I'd ever tasted. But being that woman cost a fortune. I needed a second apartment in the city to maintain the illusion. I needed a wardrobe that whispered old money. I needed a life that David's modest salary could never touch. Then the lump happened. It was a benign cyst, a tiny nothing that the doctor cleared in 5 minutes. But that evening, when I saw the look of pure, terrified devotion in David's eyes as I mentioned the doctor's visit, a dark, opportunistic bulb went off in my brain. I didn't tell him it was nothing. Instead, I let a tear fall, looked at the floor, and told him the specialist was deeply concerned. Within a week, the lie had grown legs. I told him it was an aggressive, rare form of stage 3 cancer. I told him the only hope was an experimental, non-FDA-approved treatment protocol in the city that our insurance wouldn't touch. I watched the color drain from his face, and for a second, a flicker of guilt stabbed at me. But then he grabbed my hands, his knuckles white, and promised me he would do whatever it took. "We aren't losing you, Claire," he whispered. "I'll find the money. I don't care what I have to do." David didn't hesitate. He took out a second mortgage on our small, happy home. He started working his teaching job by day, driving for Uber until 2 in the morning and pulling grueling double shifts at a shipping warehouse on the weekends. I watched him physically change. He lost 20 pounds in the first 4 months. His skin took on a gray, sallow tint, and his eyes were perpetually bloodshot from a lack of sleep. Every Friday, like clockwork, he would hand me a check or show me the bank transfer into what he believed was my specialized medical savings account. In reality, that account was a slush fund for my double life. It paid the $3,000 monthly rent on a penthouse overlooking the river. It paid for the 5-course dinners I shared with Julian while David was eating a cold sandwich in his car between Uber fares. I got terrifyingly good at the theater of illness. I bought expensive, realistic wigs and wore them around the house, leaving clumps of synthetic hair in the shower drain for David to find. I used gray eyeshadow to create deep, sunken hollows under my eyes whenever I knew David was coming home. I'd spend my afternoons with Julian, draped in silk and drinking vintage champagne. Then I'd drive to a grocery store parking lot near our house, pull on a tattered headscarf, wipe off my expensive lipstick, and walk through my front door looking like I was one breath away from the end. The cruelty was in the details. David would come home at midnight, his back aching from the warehouse, and he'd still insist on rubbing my feet or heating up organic broth because he thought my chemo-ravaged stomach couldn't handle real food. He sold his vintage 1967 Mustang, the car his father had left him, the one thing he truly loved, just to cover what I told him was a crucial genomic sequencing scan. I took that money and bought Julian a gold Rolex for his 35th birthday, telling him it was a bonus from the firm. I told myself the remission would be my exit. I'd recover, wait 6 months, and then stage a quiet divorce so I could move to the city permanently. But the greed was a sickness of its own. The money was too easy, and the power I felt over both men was intoxicating. The tower I had built finally collapsed on a rainy Tuesday in October. I told David I had been admitted for a 48-hour observation at the clinic. In reality, I was at the penthouse with Julian, hosting a small elite gathering for his new gallery opening. I was wearing a backless emerald silk dress, my real hair styled in glossy waves, standing on the balcony with a glass of Bordeaux. And I didn't know that David's car had finally died on the highway. I didn't know he had spent his last $60 on a train ticket into the city because he'd been having terrifying chest pains and wanted to see a doctor at the same hospital he thought I was in. He was walking toward the pharmacy near the station when he looked up at the luxury high-rise across the street. The lighting on the balcony was perfect. He saw me. He didn't see a dying woman. He saw his wife. Vibrant, healthy, and draped in the arms of a man who looked like he stepped out of a magazine. I didn't know he was there until I walked into our darkened house the next afternoon. The air felt heavy, stagnant. Usually David would have a welcome home card or a single rose waiting for me after a treatment. Instead, the kitchen table was a battlefield of paper. He had printed every bank statement from the last 3 years. He had the mortgage documents and a pile of invoices I'd faked on my laptop. And in the center of it all was a single, grainy photo he had taken with his phone from the street. David was sitting in the shadows of the corner chair. He looked like a skeleton, a hollowed-out version of the man I had married. He told me he'd called the clinic. He'd called to see if he could donate his own bone marrow or if there were any trials he could join to lower our costs. The nurse had been confused. She told him they hadn't had a patient by the name of Claire Sullivan in their system, ever. He looked at the photo of me on the balcony and asked me, in a voice that was barely a whisper, if I had sold his father's car so I could buy another man a watch. I tried every lie in the book. I tried to claim I was in a fugue state. I tried to say the stress of thinking I was sick had made me snap. But David just stood up, his movements slow and pained. He told me he had spent the morning at the police station. This wasn't just a betrayal of the heart. It was a felony. I had defrauded him of over $200,000 through identity theft and mail fraud. The fallout was a public execution of my character. David didn't stay to watch the debris fall. He filed for divorce and cooperated fully with the district attorney. When the story hit the local news, the cancer con artist, the world I'd built with Julian vanished instantly. Julian didn't even give me the courtesy of a confrontation. He was a social climber who realized his wealthy executive was a middle-class fraud. He blocked my number and vanished before the first police report was even finalized. I lost the house, the penthouse, and my freedom. I was sentenced to 5 years of probation and a lifetime of restitution. The real ending, the one that haunts me in the quiet of my studio apartment, happened on the day the divorce was finalized. I saw David in the hallway of the courthouse. He looked like himself again, stronger, clear-eyed, and at peace. He was with a woman who worked at the hospital, someone who actually knew what it meant to care for the sick. I tried to stop him. I wanted to tell him that somewhere in the middle of the lies, I still loved him. He didn't yell. He didn't even look angry. He just looked through me like I was a ghost he'd finally stopped believing in. He walked past me without a word, leaving me alone with the debt of a life I never really lived. Now, I work 2 retail jobs, and every month, 60% of my pay is snatched away to pay back the man I nearly killed with a lie. I didn't have cancer, but I was a parasite. And the thing about parasites is that once the host is gone, they have nothing left to feed on but themselves.